Now I'd like to introduce you to today's presenters, Professor Bob Sutton and Hayagriva Rao and John Lilly. John Lilly is a partner at Greylock, as well as on the board of directors of Crew, Figma, Angle Technologies, Caffeine, Code for America, and more. John is also the former CEO of Mozilla and a Stanford University alum. He's also a co-teacher in the Graduate School of Business People Operations course with Huggy Rao. Also, we have Bob Sutton, who is a professor of management science and engineering in the Stanford School of Engineering, and Professor Huggy Rao is professor of organizational behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Together, they have written a book titled Scaling Up Excellence, hosted a podcast titled Friction on Organization Culture, and are academic directors of our online professional education program, Stanford Innovation and Entrepreneurship Certificate. Now that we've welcomed them, I will turn it over to them.
Great. Thank you so very much, Annette. It's a delight to be here this morning with John on the one hand and Bob on the other. And our plan is to actually have a conversation and maybe take questions in the last 10 minutes or so. Is that right, Annette?
Yes.
Wonderful. So let's actually begin, John, right away. Why the word people operations? Why not HR? Why not personnel?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure who coined the term. I think my guess is that it's what they call it at Google. Famously, Laszlo Bachman, running people ops at Google, called it this. And I think it was intentional to reframe it to everybody who worked there. And I think HR, human resources, human capital, all the things that we call these things for years. I think they have a bit of a fixed sensibility. I think where people ops is a sense that people operations, you're trying to make a system that runs over time. And I think that something that has feedback loops and changes and evolves over time. So that's my sense of why that term's evolved. I've always liked it because it's more active than an asset, human resources, human capital.
So when you're actually looking at startups, what do you particularly pay attention to when you think of people operations?
Yeah, well, we talk about this a lot in our class at the business school, but it really depends on the stage of company. So a lot of times people come to us in the business school and you talk about hiring, they think of hiring as well. I get my resumes from my HR department and I pick the best resumes I like, and then I go talk to this person, I pick the best one. And for what we found for startups, even for bigger companies like Mozilla when we were there, is that the best candidates don't just come in the front door. So it's like, again, like the word people ops itself, it's an active orientation, which is recruiting. So it's like, how do you even get people to know about the company? How do you get people to care? How do you get people to come? And it's a two-way conversation rather than sitting back and evaluating. So I think that's the main.
So I have a question related to that. Is it your experience it's better to hire people who have worked together before and to have them recruit one another rather than just aggregating the best, but to actually bringing people who have some experience together?
Yeah, so I think this is a tricky and long question. So I think that it sort of, if you start to play it out, it's like, well, if you hire people that you know, then you'll tend to be very homogenous. You'll tend to hire people who look like you, who have the same background as you, that kind of stuff. And there's an old African proverb, like if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Right. And I think of that as like as a start to scale up. I think when you're starting, you have to have some shared background because there's just the demands are too high. So you've got 3 or 4 or 10 people all trying to do things, and if you don't have shared background, then you have to figure everything out from first principles. So so I think it helps to have people who have worked together, who know each other. I think in the limit though, when you get a big company, then you want to be diverse because I think diverse will give you more robust ideas, more strength. And so the question, so I think we know that when you start, you want to be a little homogenous.
Yeah,
when you finish or sustain, you want to be a little diverse. So the question is, how do you transition?
So that's, as we know, including from our colleague Kathy Eisenhart, there's evidence that shows when people have worked together before, that their startups are more likely to be successful. And since we're sitting on the Stanford campus right now, Hewlett and Packard are the famous examples. They did classes together and they figured out they could work together, and hence what was a once great technology company was formed by them. But the diversity thing's interesting. So there's an argument then you should have diverse friends early and you've got both for life.
Yeah, I think the question, it's less about diversity I think it's about diverse pathways of thought. And so I think you really want
knowledge diversity.
That's
which often is related to diversity and background.
Okay.
And so I think the question is more like, if you start with a core who's worked together, I think it's much more likely to succeed. And you can look at almost any startup. it starts with a core of people who know each other.
Right.
I think it comes down to like shared language, but also trust.
Mm.
I think it's very hard to trust people who don't come from some shared background.
Uh-huh.
But then the question is like within the first 10 people, the first 20 people, the first 50 people, how do you build more and more new diversity in?
Mm.
You know, there's a lot of companies that will start and you know, unfortunately it'll be the first 5 people will be men.
Right.
And then they'll hire their friends, which will be the next 15 people will be men. And the next thing you know, you got the 20% company that's all dudes. And so like, how do you hire the first female into that group? Like, good luck. And so there are other companies like, you know, Brett Taylor, the one I'm here, and he famously started Quip, and they recruited for diversity from nearly the beginning.
Right.
And as a result, they had something like 40% women on the engineering team when they were getting to scale before they got bought by Salesforce. So I think it's tricky. I think you have to be a little homogenous when you start.
You have to be a little homogeneous. So for our readers, I just want to draw your attention to that wheel on the slide there. That wheel actually represents a framework that John and I, along with Sujay Jaswa, we use it in the course on people operations, startup to scale up. It's actually built around an acronym called FARTHER. John accuses me of liking acronyms, and I plead guilty to the charge. So the acronym FARTHER the F stands for finding people, the A is for aligning them, the R is for real-time feedback, the T is for teaming, the H is for hacking, the E is for engaging, and the R is for reinventing. And at the center is, of course, the mindset of the organization, the culture that is there. Thus far, we've actually been focusing on finding people. And so that's where we are. But before we move to the other elements, John, can you give us a sense when you advise startups and you work with them, you know, what's the ratio of the number of people you meet and the hires you close? Is it like 1 hire for every 10 people you meet, or is it much more than that? And is that even a useful diagnostic?
Yeah, that's an interesting, I don't know quite how to characterize that. What I would say is that we think a lot about pipelines. And so I focus less on the output, which is the number of hires, and more on like, how do you build process for flow? So you see enough people and enough diversity in the pipeline. And so what we spend a lot of time in early startups is like, how do we find and how do we find and evaluate the right people, and then how do we convince them to come? And so then if you think about the pipeline, it's like, well, you have to go look through LinkedIn and all the resumes, and you have to filter that down to calling out, like sending emails and like see who responds to you, and then doing phone screens, and then you do a phone screen, a technical screen to an on-site interview, on-site interview to eventually maybe an offer, and an offer to acceptance. And we think about like, this is a pipeline, it's like a marketing pipeline. And so you've got numbers, and then you've got conversion ratios in each one. And so the questions both like how to get true positives, like how to avoid false positives, how to avoid false negatives, how to, and we've just really focused a lot on the conversions. Like the most expensive 2 parts of that funnel are on-site interviews, because you bring somebody in, they spend half a day or a day with basically your core team, your most important team, and then, which is a very expensive operation. And then once you find somebody you like them and make them an offer, you really want to close. And so the 2 like conversion numbers I really focus on are the number of people we bring on site, how many of those do we make an offer to? And I try to make sure that I think most startups are probably like a quarter to a third of the people we bring on site. I think that you can build a more robust, a better filter than that. So we try to get closer to half. And then when you offer to acceptance, that's critical, and we spend a lot of time being very active in how do you make the offer. You make the offer when they're ready to get it. You do a lot of things around it to make sure that they're ready to get the offer and to accept the offer. And that, like, you really want to be well over 50%. It's harder now because I think a lot of millennials in particular are gathering up a lot of offers. They have 5 or 6 to choose from.
So I have a question. So you're focusing on how important it is to have a high yield rate. So I would sort of do a yes and with another perspective, and I'm thinking of especially in the old days at Netflix, we spent a lot of time talking to crazy Patty McCord about their system. And Patty described how a lot of what their goal was before people got into interview, that they would give them such a sufficient cultural preview that people would self-screen out so that the people who would agree to be interviewed actually would want the job.
For
So
sure.
do you do anything to sort of discourage the people who won't fit to sort of take themselves out of the pool?
Yeah, I think this is like critical to understanding what the organization you're building is. And so Patty famously built this Netflix culture deck, which it was a little self-aggrandizing. It was a little bit like, it was not exactly right, but I think they were trying to distill their values in such a provocative way where people like would either say, "Oh my God, I love that," or be repulsed by it. Like no vacation policy, ugh. And so I think that
either you're a superstar or you're fired.
Yeah, and so I think what hiring is, you're trying to elicit is like a strong match. So you're trying to figure out like how do you build, especially for startups and early companies, you're trying to figure out how do you build an organization with the spikiest people, not the best on average, but like the spikiest in certain areas. And so I think the culture deck was a really good thing that she did. You know, more recently Henry Ward of eShares has done the same kind of thing. Like here's how we do it, here's how we interview if you don't like it. And you know, I remember. I mean, I think the best leaders do this. So I remember when I was at Apple when Steve Jobs came back. I think I told you guys this before, but he gave this big speech one time, and Apple was, I think we were trading for, like, basically had $2 billion in cash, and the market cap of Apple was $2 billion. We were trading about at cash. Everybody thought we were going to get bought by Sun, and Steve came back and said, "Look, we're going to reinvent the company, and we're going to all your shares are underwater, and so we're going to revest your shares." It's all going to be in the money, but they're going to invest for 3 years, and we're going to go out and we're going to build amazing products and change the world. If you don't believe it, get the hell out. And what that did, nobody left. They all galvanized the people who wanted to be on that.
Wasn't it the same meeting where Michael Dell predicted that the company's got a business? And what was Steve's response?
I'm not sure I'm allowed to say that.
No, we can censor it.
So the you have to do an 8-second bleep. The like Spike Lee in the Oscars. The Michael Dell and the Dell earnings call. And y'all remember Dell Computer because it's so important these days. Actually, there's a Dell right there. But somebody on the Dell earnings call said, "What should Apple do with the money?" And Michael Dell famously said, "Well, they should give it back. They should shut down the company, give it back to shareholders." And right after Steve said, "Look, we're going to reinvest your options," someone who had more courage than I do got up and said, "Hey, what did you think?" In the Q&A session, "Hey, what did you think about what Michael Dell said about what we should do?" And there was this dead silence. And Steve, like, he just was quiet. He eventually said, "F Michael Dell." He didn't use that word. I don't usually use that. I usually use the real word too, but I'm self-conscious about it. But after he said that, like, everybody in the place would have followed him.
So that's a great. I mean, so Huggy and I write about when excellence is scaled, you need two things. This is straight from his work on social movements. You need a hot cause. You need to crank up this collective anger and pride, and you need to link it to tangible behaviors. To me, that's a perfect example. Well, he was changing the options, but then he got the emotions going too.
So, I want to pick up on one thing that you just mentioned a little while ago, John. You used the term match between a recruit and the company in the hiring process. I'm assuming by that you meant fit. In other words, does the new recruit fit into the company? Does the company fit with the aspirations of the individual?
Sure.
Do we always hire individuals for fit? What about stretch? Don't you hire people to stretch the ability of a company to get it to do more? Do you do those kinds of hires differently, or is it the same thing? Or
yeah, I think this is a critical point. So I think when we say the word fit, often it's shorthand for what people call culture fit.
Right.
Well, they fit our culture,
right.
Which is, I think you guys know the studies better than I do, which is very often shorthand for this person is like me.
Right.
Yeah. My favorite person, me.
That's right. It'll tend to reinforce homogeneity and not against diversity. And so I think when I say match, what I think you're trying to do is understand what are the criteria you're hiring for, and does this person match those criteria? And you're trying to pull out I think you're trying to, as much as you can, make the criteria explicit, so you can be somewhat objective. I think that we're humans, we're all biased creatures. But I do think that I try not to use words like fit or culture fit to the extent possible. So I think it elides a whole bunch of hidden personal and cultural values.
So let me, you've seen, I'm sure, a lot of people and interviewed them, and I want to focus on the interview part. I realize, of course, interviews have their own limitations, and you have to actually qualify the prospect, as you mentioned, in a variety of other ways. But I'm curious, in your interview process, have you found a useful diagnostic question, or have you found something that immediately surfaces red flags for you?
Yeah, so I think I probably interviewed, give or take, 10,000 people in my
that's what
career,
I would have thought.
and probably hired a couple of thousand. I find the more people I interview, the less I believe in my ability to interview. And what I mean is,
well, you're not fitting the literature. Good for you.
well, what I meant is that I think there was a time when I was very confident in my ability to spend 15 minutes with somebody and like know them.
Right.
And I think the more people I've interviewed, the more I feel like interviews are these like profoundly overloaded contexts where you don't have a shared background, you don't have shared understanding of goals. You don't have, it's a very, the power dynamic is all messed up.
Right.
And so I've come to think of interviews as a very limited, a specific type of information. And so I think there's things you can learn. So I think you can learn whether if people are somewhat defensive. I think you can learn how people react to questions and how they react to stress situations like that. And so you tend to say, so I think that if you find people blaming, if you find people talking about their last job and say, oh, those guys did this wrong, and here's all the, if you find a lot of blaming, that's a clear red flag. I think the positives are a little harder. So I tend to, I think we're all different. I think some people come in with a roster of questions they want to ask. I come in and say, hey, what are you curious about? What are you interested in? How are you processing this so far? And so I try to co-construct knowledge with them during the thing. But especially by the time Greylock is done, just talking about the power of referencing. So now, you know, my partner Reed from LinkedIn, he'll famously say, if I could do an hour of referencing or an hour of interviewing only, I would reference, not.
Oh yeah.
And the point is that, you know, in an interview, you can only you can only observe the experience you have during the time. Whereas referencing, you can talk about months or years of collaboration. Now, it's still different because like human beings don't like saying negative things about other. Well, most
human beings.
Yeah, there's some, but and so you've got to figure out how to elicit truth in references, and that's harder to do because you have to build a strength of network and a strength of reputation and build the context where people will tell you the truth.
Well, I won't name the organizations. There's certain organizations where if you get the worst. If it's a current employee, you'll give them really positive references to get rid of them. So you really got to be careful. Then that's
they want to export their problems.
They want to export their problems. So
I think the reason most people think that interviewing is useful is because it's possible to get good at interviewing yourself, whereas you can only get good at referencing by building a network and a history and a context where people will tell you the truth over time. Like very few people will lie to Reed in front of LinkedIn about a reference because they know that he knows everyone in the world.
Right.
And but that's a product of 20 or 30 years of building.
So in other words, what referencing is it actually provides, validation from multiple sources. And that's kind of what you want. I want to go, I'm watching the time as well. So we have this little wheel with the farther framework. We've been focusing on finding people. Let's assume there is a startup here. It's gone to 25 people from like 5 people. Which of these elements would you think is the important thing for this startup at 25 to focus on?
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, the way the wheel works is in order. So I think you have to find people, you have to get them to do things. And when groups are small and you don't have to do a lot of aligning. So you just say, hey, let's go build this product or let's go build this consulting service or whatever it is. And you've got enough shared background that you can kind of just go off and do it and kind of be in your own lanes. And you're going, and the reason that's powerful is because everything's happening as fast as it can possibly happen. It's all happening in your brain. And the reason you start to get process over time is like you start to get teams and who can't see inside the founder's brain. And so the founder brain, like process is the motion of pulling stuff out of the founders and saying, oh, here's a cadence, here are weekly meetings, here's the way we build things. And you're basically trying to pull all the constructs out of your brain so that other people can contribute.
Right.
And so I would say at 25, by the time you get to 25, you've got smaller groups.
Right.
And you had to have some process, and you're starting to figure out like, oh, the groups need to figure out how to work together. So my experience has been that groups of 3 to 6 people, give or take, are about the right size.
Mhm.
That's a lot of evidence to support that.
Yeah, I think once you get to 7 or 8 or 9, there become places to hide.
Exactly.
groups.
This sort of transition from 3 to 6 to about a 30-person firm is something that we've all been involved in a little bit. What's some of the early processes you think that are useful, and what are the red flags that they're adding process that adds destructive friction? So what do you suggest adding, and what do you suggest waiting on?
Yeah, I try to layer in lightweight ways of committing, each group committing to each other.
Okay.
So that it starts with like weekly commitments or
Mhm.
weekly sprints, or maybe like it's 25 people is a little early for basically talking about quarterly, but you're trying to, for each group, you're trying to say, here's the work that we expect to get done in this.
Oh, so you're aligning the rhythms of the small number of teams.
Yep. Yeah, I call it
rhythms.
Cadence. Yeah,
Cadence with rhythms.
Because you're trying to define like here's what people should expect, and you're trying to at Mozilla we were bigger, but we had different groups, and so by the time we were bigger, we had these quarterly goals, and we had some groups like IT, information technology, who would in a quarter they would do like basically exactly 1/90th of the work every day of the 90 days. And then you had groups like the innovation group who would do approximately 0% of the work for like the first 88 days. And then they would like pull like all-nighters for a week and get them all done at the end. And what you're trying to teach is like,
You can't do that.
that's okay. Yeah, you're trying to teach about heterogeneity of things as long as you agree to your commitments.
Right.
And so I think that you're trying to layer these on lightly to start with, and you get heavier weight processes over time. But like, my first start is like, a team lead could just send out mail on Friday, say, hey, here are the 4 things that our team's doing next week. Here are the 4 things that we said we were going to do, and here's whether we did them or not.
Okay.
And here are the 4 things we need help on. And that's a super simple, like lightweight email. And with 25 people, you can like call it 5 groups. You can still see all of it.
Right. So let's assume that this startup has grown from 25 to 100.
Yeah.
So which of these things becomes kind of important then? Do you spend time on aligning, or is it about real-time feedback? Or
Yeah, well, real-time feedback.
How you team, or?
Right. So I think real-time feedback is always important. And I think that in contrast to how people think that performance management is done, which is like every annual cycle, which I find basically counterproductive. I think you've always forgotten, by December, you've forgotten what happened in February, and everybody thinks they're above average, but they aren't, it turns out, the Lake Wobegon problem. And so I think that by the time you get to about 100, you start, somebody's continuing from San Antonio, Texas. That's where I was there last week and just went to high school there. But by the time you get to 100 people, it's likely that these lightweight processes have turned heavy. And so I think that in a lot of ways, the founder has the moral authority to do is run around and like short circuit things. And so you say, oh, well, IT is not going to talk to marketing until marketing gets their goals and asks them for the quarter. And you're like, well, this is stupid. So you just run people together and jam them together. And so I find that founders start to hack things, and you start to ask questions like, does this process really represent what we're trying to do? So I think that hacking and reinvention is the most important thing.
Even at 100.
Yeah.
So
100 people is a big massive social momentum.
Right.
So, well, there's 2 things implied in that. The first one is that the CEO and actually the senior team's job needs to evolve, because they got to start delegating stuff. And you went through this at Mozilla. You got to Mozilla, there's 12 people, and you left, there's 500, some number like that. Yeah. So you had to go through this personally to figure out, like, you couldn't be everywhere at once towards the end. Yeah. So how did you figure out which stuff to keep doing and which stuff to let go? Yeah, so I think Jeff Weiner, who runs LinkedIn, talks the most about aligning and how you align cultures. And what I mean when I say aligning is you're trying to make sure that if meetings happen without you, that roughly the same thing happens whether you're in the room. And so I think it's pretty good. In a lot of ways, what that means is you just have to spend time together. And so I think almost every team that I know has a senior staff meeting once a week where they just spend time, and it's like relatively unstructured. I think Apple spends all day Mondays together looking at everything across the business.
I ended up doing skip level meetings where every couple of weeks we'd have me and meeting with all the directors and VPs, and I'd be trying to model behavior and model non-defensiveness and model all that stuff.
Yeah, I remember talking to you once, and you were worried that people didn't feel safe having constructive arguments. So you said that you were actually holding constructive arguments in the hallway so people could see that it was okay.
Yeah,
that was kind of amazing.
Yeah, what you're trying to do is, I think that the best managers are specific and explicit and candid and non-judgmental by and large. So I think you're trying to say that, like, the only thing I really penalized in Mozilla was if people were hiding the ball. So if somebody's like, so you say, well, what do you need help with? And people said, we got it. Like, that would always be like a sign where I'd start asking lots of questions. Like, make sure you have it. Like, the wobbly they are, the more you want to build all the way down.
Yeah. Can I just intro? We have some interesting questions from our viewers.
Oh, good.
And I thought we'd kind of seed one of them.
That sounds fun.
So one of the colleagues here, Gamma, I think, says, I run a business that employs 13 people. We have built a particular culture, but it's resulted in a culture that I don't particularly like. And when is the right time to work on the company culture? Is it in the aligning of the organization? How does one change culture? Which of the elements of the wheel would you intervene in?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that, my Mitch Kapor, who started Lotus, he had this phrase. He says, you need to build a house you want to live in. And what he meant by that is this, which is like, you need to build the company you want to work at.
That's right.
And so if you build a company that you think you're supposed to, because like you think that the Stanford GSB thing study says build a company this way, or you're trying to maximize shareholder value, or be very travesty and Uber. Like if you build the company you think you're supposed to build, almost always you end up with this thing that doesn't quite look like you want. And so I think it's important all along to say, well, here's what I'm trying to do, and here's where I think the deltas are. And when I say culture, I think a lot of people think it means like, what snacks do we have, and where do we go for dinner, and like how long are lunches and stuff, what kind of t-shirts do we wear. When I say culture, I mean it's how you make decisions and what you celebrate, what you reward and what you penalize. And I think this has to be constant. So I think you have to build channels to the whole company so that every week, every day, you can say, oh, look at Sherry who did this thing. This is amazing. It helps the company. No, you're being defensive about this. So I'm going to ask you a whole bunch of questions that are going to make you feel like you don't want to be defensive again.
Yeah, so the way we describe it, Huggy and I, is that we ask what's sacred and taboo, and we look to see if they actually have something that fits their business. And then we also look for agreement, not to use the name of a company, but to use the name of a company. Right after our book came out in 2014, we were sitting around a table with the 8 top people in engineering at Twitter. And so Huggy and I, we just asked the question, I asked what's sacred and what's taboo. They couldn't answer the question. Each person said, well, I could tell you about my last company, Salesforce, Apple, whatever, but they actually didn't know what was sacred and taboo at Twitter. And we were, ooh, that's not a good sign.
Yeah, I think this brings up the other point, which is I think most companies slide through these things and they don't make, so number one, they feel like culture is fixed.
Right.
And so they don't explicitly change it. The other is like they change it little bits at a time. And what I found as we grew in Mozilla was I couldn't change my message every day. I needed it to be the same message until there was a change. And then I needed to say, everybody, we're changing now. Here's a big break. And we just went through this with one of the companies I work with, where they started with the 4 core values. And one of them was kindness, for example. And look, I value kindness. We try to teach it to our kids every single day. And I try to remember it in my own life. But it wasn't working for us as a corporate value. And so the CEO actually just went and rewrote it. And so he said, okay, we're gonna go and redo this, and we're gonna acknowledge that it's changed, and like sign up, or re-sign up, or move on, and that's okay.
That's one of my favorite examples of that is somewhere near the end of his tenure, Andy Grove of Intel fame, he took having fun off the badges because he said that's disingenuous. We do all sorts of things that aren't fun, and we're going to ask you to do things that aren't fun to succeed in. I think we should be honest about it. That was one of my kind of favorite examples of a CEO telling the truth and having a good reason for it.
So I want to go back to some of the questions. And so there's an interest in how do you stress test some of these elements in the wheel.
Ooh.
So can we stress test alignment or finding people? Like, how do you know your alignment is working? How do you know you're finding the right kind of people? I mean, is there a stress test that you'd recommend? I think that's the question readers are contemplating.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you guys have a point of view on this. I think that with the like you always have to bring it back to what's the organization, why does the organization exist, and what are you trying to do? And like the truth is, like all you really have is proxy metrics, because it's hard to say, well, we want revenue to be high this quarter and every employee to figure out how to do that. And so you've got, well, revenue might associate with user metrics or hiring metrics or whatever. And so I think you've got to figure out like what are we measuring ourselves against, and how do we tell whether we're getting better or worse? And a lot of times I think you're practicing making commitments to each other, like making commitments and then being honest about whether you hit the commitments or not.
So let me turn the question another way around, maybe to rethink of stress tests as a question of variance. So, you know, in any organization, you have average, quality, or the mean, and you have the variance around the mean. Now, you know, when would you recommend that, you know, is high variance good or is it bad? Or put another way, while it's great to find people, how do you go about firing people?
Ooh,
I mean, do you need to do that quickly in a startup, or like, do you do that late? Or
so this is something Heidi and I talk about a lot, and I always think of the Netflix versus the Ed Catmull model. So Patty McCord, the Netflix no performance improvement plan, they walk in, you're gone. And I had a guy, Eric Colson, now at Stitch Fix. He basically described firing about 80 out of 120 people, and he said, I love them, they just didn't fit anymore. And and then there's Ed Catmull, and when we interviewed Ed, we said, Ed, so what do you do with non-performers? He said, well, I used to fire them quicker, but now what I do, when I did that, it would create fear. But now what I do is I wait for everybody to tell me that that person sucks. And then when I fire them, there's no fear. So he said, I've learned to wait longer. And that was one of the only, maybe the only person, and Huggy and I just completely stopped. He didn't say it, he might have been talking about firing directors in particular. But still, to me, there's two completely different philosophies there.
Very well put, Bob. Very well put.
Yeah, I think Ed's a very smart guy. So I think that when Ed says something, you should.
Yeah, well, and sees things differently.
Yeah, that's right. I think also that the conventional wisdom would be hire fast, fire fast.
Yes.
I think either is fine as long as you understand what your philosophy is and you are explicit about it and intentional about it. So what I mean is that I kind of view hiring a person, them coming to work for your company, is you're making a two-sided commitment. So the person's committing to work for your company, and the company is committing to do some set of things to help that person be successful. This is how I think about it. What that means is that there's a burden on you to make the hiring decision, and once you do that, there's some obligation you have to do what you said.
So it's back to the mindset.
Yeah,
so if there's agreements, it helps.
Now, I think there's other ways to do that, but that's my philosophy, and that will tend to mean that you're trying to understand what the context is and what the person's failing, and then you try to say, well, here's the gap. Can we talk together about how to close the gap in some time-boxed way? That's how I do it, which is kind of in the middle between fire fast and like let everybody tell me to fire.
Yeah, I
find that a little passive, by the way. So I find it sounds like he's doing it because empirically he's realized that it's net positive or more positive to do it this way, to let everybody tell him it's bad.
Right.
I find that a little bit passive management is almost never, in my experience, very good.
Yeah,
so that's interesting.
Let me push all of us on this a little bit. I'm kind of wondering, is it a matter of personal philosophy, or does it actually have a lot to do with what the business is all about? So when I think of Ed and Pixar, it's a creative business. And
very long-term time horizon.
Long-term time horizon,
yeah,
where risk-taking is important. I'm wondering, maybe the reason he delays firing is he doesn't want fear to chill risk-taking. On the other hand, when I look at some of the companies you advise, there the task is a little different. Often it's a new product development task. And in any, as you would know better than I would, in any new product development task, it's the weakest link who dictates the pace of new product development. And so does it actually have to do with how the task differs between new product development and creativity?
Yeah, I think we know that is for sure true, because even inside one company, you'll have different firing patterns across different functions.
Yep.
That's right.
So sales is very numeric. Like
Right.
engineers get worked up sometimes about like why do salespeople pay a commission? Why do they make so much money? And like the truth is like because if they miss their number, they're fired.
Right.
And so sales implement sales pay compliments look like this all the time, whereas engineer compliments look like this.
Right.
Okay. But and so I think that it's different type functions and it should be different type companies. But I do think it's important to be intentional and say this is the commitment we're making to
Right.
employees. This is the commitment employees are making to us.
Right. So when does engagement become an issue? When you become 50,000 or when you become 5,000 or 500 or, can you give us and, when does reinvention become a top priority?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question was more like when does disengagement happen and when does disengagement start to hurt the company? I think that, I don't know, the most interesting company is everybody's pretty engaged. I do think that you mentioned Hewlett and Packard, which is kind of ancient history now, but Packard used to talk about management by walking around MBWA, and he would just walk around and he'd sit at an engineer's desk and say, hey, tell me what you're doing. And my sense is that that was a very, very effective way of managing. And I think it's connecting and it strips away the organization chart, that kind of stuff. You guys know that when I was CEO of Mozilla, I had a standing desk that was basically in the middle of the hallway.
Right.
And I put it there because I wanted to make sure that as people were walking back and forth, like we always made eye contact. If you make eye contact, that means you almost always have to talk. And so that was one way of just encouraging people to talk and say hello to even somebody who might be in a different org or 3 levels up or whatever.
Right, right. So again, I'm keeping track of time here. So some months ago, I invited this executive from Uber. Bob and I wrote a case study, of course, on Uber and Tuan Pham, but this was a different CTO. Executive, and he had worked in Uber so I asked him, I said, hey, how long have you worked in Uber? And he said, I worked there for 4 years. And I said, 4 years? And he laughed and he said, I know it's 4 years, but for me, it feels like I worked in 16 different companies. Each quarter, it was a different company. Was he sort of exaggerating, or is this how fast companies change as they scale?
Yeah, I think Uber is a very special case because of the just massive ambition and massive growth trajectory. But even at companies I'm involved with, I talk about organizations as prototypes. So we just rolled out an organization last week where we changed some things, and he said, look, this is an 8-week prototype. And I feel like it's framing it up for people. It's like, oh, well, these are not my reports. This is not my org. This is an experiment that we're going to have to see how work gets done. And so we're trying to create some disassociation with the organizational structure itself. I do find that people get really locked into org structures and really into like, here are my reports, here's my org, and my one-on-ones. And I try to break that everywhere I can. Because I feel like, facts on the ground, facts inside the company, they all change. They change rapidly. And so there's some things you want to get locked in. You want to get the sales execution engine going, you want to get the QA engine going. But I think for a lot of things where the terrain is unknown, you're not sure you have the right org.
So that's to dig into that a little bit. One of the things that we look for, it's basically habit. So you start using SOPs to do the exact same thing, and that's great when you're doing the right thing. But when you're doing the wrong thing the right way, and you can go down really quick. Any red flags you look for that people are just doing what they've always done because they've always done it, and you gotta put the brakes.
Yeah, so the red flag is when you get people not asking questions. So
silence is not golden.
Yeah, so the very early days of data science in 2005, we brought somebody before it's called data science into Mozilla because we had 100 million users, and we just couldn't tell what's happening in the user base. And so we brought a data scientist who worked for Steve Levitt on Freakonomics in, and so he just started generating reports, and I had him send them to me every night at 7 o'clock. And my executive team didn't like this very much because everybody's just gotten home, had dinner, and they would see this report. They'd see this report coming through, and then like at 7:03, like there'd be me responding. It's like, why does this look like this? And why happened in Germany? And what does it look like this? And I was trying to teach people like every day, look at things and say, oh, why does it look like this? What's happening? Yeah, and people didn't love it because they felt like they had to answer the questions, but it got better over time, and then they started asking questions at 7:03 or 7:02 before I could.
I want to sort of step in here and invite our viewers to send more questions.
Yes.
We've got about 10, 15 minutes more. I'm going to sort of pick a couple of questions, but please add them. These questions are gifts for us, so don't forget that. So one lovely question that somebody put up, I think it was a little bit before, was titles. Yeah, are titles a thing a CEO ought to think about, or are they sops to people? Like, well, what are they? I mean,
yeah, I'm curious what the research does on this. Like I struggle with this. Sometimes I think about titles as free gives to people. Like they are early in the organization. I think as the organization gets bigger, they become quite expensive. They imply things about how what the organization looks like. You know, a lot of companies today don't want to hire directors or VPs, and they'll call everybody a head of something to indicate leadership and ownership. I think this is a challenging question. I don't really have a good answer to. I think that you should be clear about who's on your executive team. I think you should be clear about ownership, and I think to the extent you can, you should be clear about compensation progression.
right,
So having 5 or 6 levels people progress through.
right.
I think comp levels almost always should be divorced from titles.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. Relay title gets right, where the decision rights are unclear. What that leads to is a bunch of dysfunctional conflict where people act like cats scratching for to the top. So I think that's the most important thing.
I think the way people do that is with DRIs, so directly responsible individuals, and say this is the person responsible for this set of decisions. I think that's the clearest, crispest way to do it. It sometimes means that things fall in the cracks.
Did you do a weird study on titles?
Yeah, we actually did a mischievous study on titles where what we did was, in this experiment with 82 new venture teams, in the treatment condition, we asked all the teams in both conditions were 4-person teams. They had to build a prototype. We had to get an external panel of judges to evaluate the prototype. But in the treatment condition, all that we asked was, we asked people and said, come up with a job title that showcases your unique personal strength. So, and it was extraordinary. People came up with titles like Guru of Cybersecurity, Defender of the Source Code, Chief Schmoozer, Chief Banana, Chief Instigator. And we were kind of quite surprised that at the end of the experiment, teams where people chose their own job titles, they actually built a prototype faster. But most importantly, the prototypes they built, they, at least in the eyes of an external panel of judges, were measurably superior to the prototypes prepared by the other teams in the control condition.
Why?
So my sort of speculation is, the moment, and we actually had evidence of this, when you ask people to choose their own job titles, the first thing is you're actually triggering a sense of ownership. You chose the title. The other equally vital thing was, in the teams where people chose their own job titles, it was very clear who should do what. There was no confusion about the division of labor. So, you know, people were specialists in an area, you kind of went to them, they were supposed to do that. You know, there wasn't like, hey, this is my issue, this is not my issue, I'm not, you know, etc. So knowledge utilization actually unfolded far more efficiently in such teams. And in teams where everybody had like cookie cutter titles, it was kind of opaque. You just didn't know who was good at what.
That makes sense.
So that was
people who say that's not my job or not my area. That's the biggest red flag. The organization's busted. I mean, across everything, I think that's the #1 thing. Is like, oh, that's not my job.
right. Any other question that strikes your fancy, Bob, John?
Somebody asked about how you build culture in remote workforces, which I think is an important question. I think we're seeing in Silicon Valley. People move. We're starting development centers everywhere. Mozilla was a big distributed workforce. We had people everywhere, probably in 30 different countries around the world, even when we were with 400 or 500 people. And yeah, I think it's just like anything else. You have to decide like how are you going to communicate. And you have to test the fidelity of communication, test engagement. But I think you also just have to figure out ways to get people to be in person together often. So like the rule I made in Mozilla was, we had enough money where I said, anytime you need to get together to work on something with somebody, fly somewhere. And I don't care where it is, just figure out where to be and where to work for a week and just be there. And I'll scream if it gets too expensive. And I never complain. complained about.
So very minor thing for those of you interested in the question of virtual teams that are geographically dispersed. Our wonderful colleague Pam Hines of the School of Engineering has actually done very interesting research in that area. And if I recall her findings, and this goes back to your point again, John, what she found was the two things that if you didn't watch these things, geographically dispersed teams could become subcultures. You're in Shanghai, I'm in San Francisco, and then you kind of fight about everything. The two things that they, in her work with Mark Mortensen, that they found were very valuable to deal with dispersion was, amazingly, the frequency of communication. The more
Especially face-to-face. Face-to-face early in the relationship.
And it's actually frequent, spontaneous communication as opposed to prescribed communication. And the other thing was what they found was that this spontaneous communication actually shored up a sense of shared identity.
I would think it has to be multimodal. So,
Yeah.
you know, in Mozilla we used IRC, which is sort of at some level proto
Right.
Slack. I have mixed feelings about Slack. I think Slack is very productive in many ways and counterproductive in some other ways. But we used sort of a Slack style communication thing. But I also tweeted to a lot of employees that knew what was going on. But we also, in the kitchens, like we had open Skype or Zoom or Hangout conversations that were between Mountain View and Toronto, just open all the time. So if you were going to get coffee in the afternoon in Toronto, you could see somebody getting coffee in the kitchen in Mountain View.
That's really interesting.
Spontaneous interactions, just like people who were random. And I think the other thing maybe is like monkeying with like desk and furniture layouts pretty often.
Yeah, you used to always move things around.
Yeah.
So just on Slack, so Huggy and I are doing a project now on organizational friction. And at least our take at this point, my take, I won't speak for you, is that Slack can be good or maybe not so good, but it's as a platform, it's okay. Where the problem occurs is when you start getting platform overload, and literally you can sit and watch. My daughter has a job like this. She's using about 8 different platforms at once. She's using Slack, she's using email, she's using Salesforce, and that's just some of them. I could go on. And when you start just having this overload, being able to sort of keep track where everything is, it really makes it hard for people to do their work, no matter how skilled they are. So to me, that's the bigger problem. It's sort of the tragedy of the commons, that maybe each one might be a little bit better, but then it destroys sort of the whole. You see how many screens that you'll see where she works, how many screens people have open on their little laptop is just amazing.
I suspect this is a transitionary problem. I suspect like my, you know, my 13-year-old son will be playing Fortnite and watching Fortnite and doing a FaceTime, doing all these things at the same time and texting. So my sense is that this is, it feels awkward to us because we have old brains, like one thing on the screen at a time. But I do think all these platforms are good at different things. Like I think that the expectations and norms, like if somebody texts me, like I kind of expect them to text them right back for better or worse. If somebody calls, you know, whatever. And I think Slack has different expectations, which is like whoever is around to answer a question could right away. And so there's different norms that get built up for a variety of different reasons. I think these are all different media.
But when you have too many, it gets, and you're trying to do your job, it can get tough.
Yeah, I think that it's not going to be that big a problem.
Okay, all right.
Much as we like to spend more time, we're nearing
closure.
Yeah, do you have any parting thoughts for our viewers, John? And then you, Bob, and then
I think my only sense would be that what we do in the GSB class that we teach is we say 2 things more than anything else, like be active in all these processes and be intentional about them. And so understand what you're trying to build and don't ever sort of lean back and wait for things to happen. Like be more active and proactive.
The one thing I would add, which comes up in our work all sorts of ways, is have somebody in your life who you trust and cares about you, who can tell you when you're screwing up. There's lots of people can tell you you're screwing up you might not trust, but those are the most valuable people. And if you look at research on self-awareness, the worst person to ask whether they're competent, whether they're a jerk, is that person themselves. And the best person to ask are people who know them and care about them.
Yeah, very well put. If I can just add, my own quick contribution, I'd like to swiftly underline what John mentioned, which is don't sleepwalk your way to a culture. Make sure you actually actively design it, and it's the outcome of choice, so to speak. And I think the other interesting sort of bookend is what Bob sort of mentioned is also very vital, and that is, as a startup scales, and to John's point, there's a lot of reinvention. When there's a lot of reinvention, if you're a CEO or if you're the founder, you're often leading from a position of not knowing. And when you lead from a position of not knowing, for some of us, it engenders anxiety. And if you only get in touch with your feelings of anxiety, you're bound to classify more things in the environment as threats than as opportunities. But if, on the other hand, you pursue Bob's advice and get feedback from trusted people, you're able to move from the door called doubt and uncertainty, hopefully to a room called confidence. And that in turn might allow you to pursue more.
So that's a very Huggy Rao comment, because whenever I start having an anxiety attack, he looks at me and he says, Bob, let's just think of it as an adventure. Even though things are all screwed up and they're messed up, it's amazing. You can just see it now. No matter how things screwed up are, he thinks it's fun. And I've sort of learned to kind of go along, even though it's actually a great model. And you're good about learning from mistakes and stuff, but you just, oh, this is really cool. Oh, that didn't work.
We all do make mistakes. So keep those two things in mind as you're building a culture. And in fact, in many ways, John's comments and Bob's comments are wonderful bookends. You deliberately need to design culture on the one hand, but on the other, to Bob's point, you really need to underline how you manage, how you lead when you don't know. And to Bob's point again, when you don't know, you can't afford to be a hippopotamus. You better be an elephant. When you look at a hippopotamus, the hippopotamus is the biggest part of a hippo's face, of course, is the mouth. And when you lead, when you know, we use the mouth often, but hopefully when you don't know, you become an elephant, you use your ears a little more. So good luck on your elephantine. Good luck on your elephantine adventures. Thank you all so very much for your time and energy. And thank you, John, for sharing time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to today's speakers and to all of you for attending. If you enjoyed our webinar today, you might also be interested in some of these courses. I hope to see you all next time. Thank you.
Thank you.